Welcome, everyone. We have a lot of people joining today. That's great to see, and from all over the world. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're connecting from today. My name is Unarmed Lang. I'm the Executive Director of PHAP, that's short for the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection. I'm really delighted to be serving as your host and facilitator today for this webinar entitled Strategies and Approaches for Direct Prevention of Violence, organized by NRC and PHAP. This is the first event in a two-part series on civilian safety in armed conflict. In today's session, we will be looking at programs focused on advocacy, armed actor behavior change, and direct engagement with armed actors, aiming to provide you with an overview of some of the strategies and programming options followed by organizations to help prevent violence against civilians. Next week, on the 30th of March, we'll be organizing a second event in the same series, taking a closer look at community-based protection, early warning, and conflict preparedness. So with that, we will turn to the substance of today's event. In armed conflict, civilians continue to be heavily affected. The safety of civilians is often ignored or not addressed. And civilians are, even as we know, sometimes purposely targeted by parties to a conflict. Protection services provide much needed support to vulnerable and marginalized groups and individuals, and they respond to protection concerns with remedial service provision, but humanitarian actors have overall had less success with helping to actually ensure civilians' safety in armed conflict. So this is why in today's webinar and in the one next week, we will be looking at the question of what prevention looks like within our protection of civilians programming and where civilian safety fits within the humanitarian architecture. We'll be hearing about some organizations' existing approaches to mitigate and reduce risk for the civilian population and discuss the implication of these for other humanitarian actors. Thus, the purpose of this two-part series is really to give you an idea of the range of programming that's currently being conducted in this area to inform how you approach your programming in your own organization. And we're joined today by four speakers to help us do this by providing their perspectives from their own organization's work in this area. First, very pleased to welcome Lisa Baran, Country Director for Ukraine with the Center for Civilians in Conflict. Civic, welcome, Lisa.
Hello, everybody. Hello from Kiev.
Great to have you with us. We're also joined today by Hiba Mikhail, Regional Legal and Policy Coordinator for MENA and Colombia with Geneva Call. Welcome, Hiba.
Hello, everyone from Beirut.
Great to have you. Thanks so much for joining, Hiba. And also welcoming Pilar Jimenez Arciada, Head of the Protection of Civilian Populations Unit with the International Committee of the Red Cross. Welcome, Pilar. Great to have you.
Thank you, Anhara. Hello, everyone.
Hi. And last but not least, Tiffany Eastholm, Executive Director with Nonviolent Peace Force. Warm welcome to you, Tiffany.
Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. Great to be with you today.
Great. Now, before we turn to our presenters, I would just like to briefly ask all of our participants in a brief poll what you think should be the role of humanitarian organizations in the prevention of violence. And I'm going to read out the questions and answer options now so that the interpreters can also translate these into French and Spanish. So the question is, should it be the role of humanitarian actors to engage in prevention of violence programming? Answer option 1, yes, preventing violence should be a priority for humanitarian actors. 2, yes, but it should not be a priority for humanitarian actors. 3, no, it should be left to other types of organizations. And 4, I'm not sure. please feel free also to comment in the chat on why and what you think should be the role of humanitarian actors in this area. So we'll give some time for those responses to come in. In the meantime, we'll move on and then come back to take a look at those answers later on. So now we're going to start with a brief overview of the 4 programs that our presenters will be introducing and the kinds of situations where they're applied. We'll be following this up later in the event by looking at specific success stories, lessons learned that can be applied by other organizations, as well as how these programs fit into the wider humanitarian architecture or ecosystem, if you will. So now, turning first to Lisa, as the country director for Civic in Ukraine, could you tell us how you're approaching the prevention of violence? Over to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Anharat. Civic's work in Ukraine is addressed at reduction of harm to civilians who are caught in the conflict in the east of the country. And we do so through a multi-tier approach. We work with the government of Ukraine to promote the adoption of a national strategy on protection of civilians. We work with the armed forces of Ukraine to set up new tools, mechanisms, basically their capability to protect civilians. And we work at the grassroots level through our community-based protection initiatives. And obviously, all 3 tiers are interconnected. For example, the strategy sets a ground for these systematic changes within the armed forces of Ukraine, which can then be institutionalized, obviously, there. And our community-based activities, they inform our strategy at the national level. And at the same time, they provide real-life examples, scenarios, which we are using in our trainings for the armed forces of Ukraine, in our discussions with them, and so on and so forth. So when we came to Ukraine, we deliberately made the choice to work with the Ukraine side, the armed forces of Ukraine. This was a deliberate decision informed by our rules of engagement, and plus just a very pragmatic assessment of where our contribution, our assistance will reach most impact. Obviously, it took quite some time for us to be acknowledged by these, military, they are specific people, to acknowledge that we can bring in some technical expertise and help them with building the system of protection of civilians within them. And I would say that at this moment, they do recognize us as real kind of equal partners. We have a memorandum of understanding signed by the general staff. And obviously, we are engaging them in different types of educational and training programs, as well as in our community-based approach initiatives, which I will talk a bit later. I know, and probably, I can imagine that there are some of you who, when reading the agenda of this meeting today, thought, oh, why Ukraine? There are so many other devastating conflicts going on around the globe. I have an answer to this question. So we at Civic consider that prevention of civilian harm is as important as addressing any harm that already occurred due to a conflict. And in a context like Ukraine, where there is a lot of uncertainty, you never know how the conflict will evolve, there is a lot of space to create this preventive environment. And while there is, there is a low-paced conflict right now, at this particular day, it allows to work at the systematic approach, the three layers that I just described, and at the same time allows to do some programming that normally takes a long time when we are talking about behavioral change. and talking about different new practices by the military, obviously, but more so probably the communities. We consider community members as agents of their own protection. Therefore, to learn and to figure out their own approach within the context in Ukraine takes some time, but then it leads to more sustainable results, obviously. And a couple of last points at this stage. A couple of things that we consider crucial for successful programming in countries like Ukraine, and probably it's similar to others. So the buy-in and understanding of strategic advantage of protection of civilians by high-level politicians, high-level military commanders is key to make this change and to set up a sustainable and systematic approach to protection of civilians. And another thing that probably you all experienced over the especially last year when the COVID started, is a lot of patience required to work with all the stakeholders, and especially at the grassroots level, when you have to work and navigate the work with the communities, so that they take this incremental approach to developing their own protective mechanisms. So with this, I will stop at this point and will pass on the floor to the next speaker. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Thank you very much, Lisa. Before jumping to the next speaker, I'll just take us back briefly to that poll. I have the results in to share with you. So of everyone on the call today, yes, the vast majority, more than 70%, think that preventing violence should be a priority for humanitarian actors. 21% say yes, it should be. They should be engaged, but it should not be a priority. And then much smaller numbers thinking that it should be left to other organizations. So thanks so much for sharing your thoughts on that, and do feel free to discuss in the chat, particularly that question of priority, as there's some disagreement there. So turning next to Hiba. Hiba, what would you highlight about the approach of how Geneva Call works to prevent violence in armed conflict? Over to you.
So maybe first and foremost, as part of our mandate as Geneva Call, our primary objective is to engage directly with the armed non-state actors to improve the protection of civilians in armed conflict. Of course, this is done directly through direct engagement on the knowledge, policy, and practice levels. So first of all, we can talk about the rules, the humanitarian norms in international humanitarian law, but also international human rights law, depending on the context, and then move more to policy they have in place, and then strengthen their practices as we go along the way. This is one thing we can do. What we also do, what has been also strengthened in recent years, is to work with the local communities and look at what can they do to strengthen their own protections, and how can we as Geneva Code support their advocacy efforts actually to improve the respect for these norms. So again, it plays a lot on are they aware on the fact that if they are aware of their rights and the obligations of armed actors in armed conflict, and how can they also better protect themselves, what kind of behavior is appropriate, and then once they know, they can also form their own mechanisms, and for this we are also providing support. Of course, if we're looking at when is it relevant for Geneva Code to interfere, of course, you must talk about contexts where there are armed non-state actors, first and foremost, but also it can be in a setting of armed conflict, but also in a setting of armed violence, or when things are starting to escalate, and there the preventive role or the preventive intervention is needed, just also to be able to reduce the potential harm that might arise later on. So usually when things are all heated up, it's difficult to speak about the need to respect humanitarian norms with the different actors. So if there is a chance to do it beforehand, before actually reaching the point of conduct of hostilities, let's say, this would be also a good point to start. So starting early is the way forward. Also, on the these would be the approaches we would take on direct engagement with the armed non-state actors, but also looking at the community and how can we strengthen their own response mechanisms. So this would be generally the way. I think I would stop here as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Hiba. And we look forward to coming right back to you in the next round. Thank you for that set of starter points. Now, moving to Tiffany, Nonviolent Peace Force approaches the prevention of violence in a different ways. I wonder, could you tell us a bit about the main tool that you use for this in your organization? Over to Tiffany.
Great. Yes. Thank you so much. This is a topic near and dear to our heart. For NP, we were founded as an organization for the purpose of violence prevention. That was never a question. It was not something we evolved into. It was something we started from. The tool that we use, or the methodology or toolkit, we call unarmed civilian protection. And it's really about working together as a team of civilians, local community members, the full panoply of stakeholders, including the NP team, to work pulling from a toolkit to reduce violence and increase the safety and security for civilians who are impacted by violent conflict. Our starting place is sort of when we think about sort of the, we all call the protection egg, and there's the various elements of the protective environment and the legal landscape. And in that center is the direct protection of civilians. So and the area that we kind of typically consider the purview of police or military sort of armed actors historically, although glad to see that that is really changing. And our work really starts from there and then emanates out from that point. So we work on utilizing our presence as a nonpartisan actor, which, of course, as humanitarians, we all recognize, and sort of really recognizing what that means in a hyper localized context, radically grassroots, is that our role there is really about finding common ground about safety and security and civilian protection with whoever those actors might be. So on a day-to-day basis, the direct protection work looks like doing things like protective accompaniment. So real physical work where we're accompanying individuals, can be activists, can be individuals who are being targeted for violence, groups that are targeted because of an identity marker. It could be because women being targeted as it related to sexual violence, groups that are occupying land that is being argued over ethnic identity, or other organizations, local organizations, so on and so forth, to really utilize the role that we hold in that space to deter. So it could be negotiating directly with those who are making the threats, encouraging them to make different choices. It could be supporting those people to be able to move into safer space by the presence of having a team with them, providing witness so they're not alone, and reducing the likelihood that threats are actualized. So the real direct protection piece. The other component of the work that we do, which is sort of the longer term proactive engagement, is really digging down into supporting communities to build up that local infrastructure for violence prevention, delinking our assumption that violence prevention requires force or the threat of force as its primary tool, which is something, of course, that happens in prolonged conflict. It happens everywhere, but certainly in a multi-generational conflict setting with a significant proliferation of weapons. So delinking that concept and really working to build out that space of being able to delink security from that point of view. So I'll stop there for now. We can talk more as we go.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much. And now, Pilar, so turning to you, the ICRC is arguably the most prominent actor when it comes to prevention work. I wonder if you could help us to understand, Pilar, how the approach of the ICRC might differ from the other examples that we've been hearing about. Over to you, Pilar.
Thank you. So maybe I start by saying that prevention in the ICRC does not aim directly at preventing conflict and violence, but at preventing or minimizing harmful behavior and the humanitarian suffering that it causes. So the objective is not to prevent the objective is not to prevent the conflict itself, but the violations and the related consequences, rather than some of the violent acts that in some cases might be lawful. And the way this is done is by influencing the behavior of parties to the conflict. And we do that both in times of peace as well as during conflict situations, by working to build an environment for the respect of people affected through different means, through the legal, policy, administrative, customary, and also public opinion systems. So basically, we aim at generating better awareness and better application of the existing norms, policies, and practices, or pushing for the adoption of new ones that can prevent or reduce the human cost of wars and violence. And for doing that, the first starting point for us is a context-based analysis of the patterns of violence or the specific humanitarian problems, to understand why the parties to a conflict behave in the way they do and how the people behave the way they do, and to identify the best response in order to prevent the occurrence of harmful behavior. And the analysis of the underlying causes go through the screening of the existing legal and policy frameworks, as I said, and see how they are eventually translated into knowledge procedural frameworks and how this affects their compliance. So this approach requires a close look as well at local and traditional values and norms that could be influencing the behavior, as well as some of the role of the public opinion, as I said, that may promote hate speech or other attitudes that may create humanitarian consequences in situations of armed conflict or violence. So by understanding, observing, and engaging with all these different elements, and to see how these different elements interact with each other, we can identify, on the one hand, good practices, but also some gaps in how the existing elements are being interpreted and applied, and therefore resulting in the harmful behavior that we're trying to prevent. So we basically have three ways of working in prevention. So the systemic level, the frontline level, or the diplomatic level. At the systemic level, we do it by integrating international humanitarian law treaties into domestic law, or supporting their integration, by amending or proposing laws, policies, and new procedures that may conform with practice and international standards, and also, as my other colleagues, by training armed carriers and other important stakeholders on international humanitarian law. At the frontline level, we do promotion of IHL and humanitarian values, and we bridge the international law and those values with local values and norms and traditions. So we do a lot of work, for instance, with international humanitarian law and Islam. We have started also work with international humanitarian law and Buddhism, and see how these different norms and customs and traditions uphold these values, and how can we use them. So we campaign also through public and social media to raise concerns about a given situation, and we engage with authorities on that. And obviously, we're known by increasing awareness among weapon bearers on the norms and values of IHL, help them integrate them into their own codes of conduct, but also helping them through training as well. And finally, at the diplomatic level, we also have prevention activities by raising concern and advocating at the regional, global level for further legal and policy engagement on key issues affecting specific issues, topics, or crises. So I'm going to stop there.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Pilar. We have actually quite a few questions that have come in. So I think I'm going to do a round of questions now before we move to the next section. where we'll be looking at some concrete examples. So let me first turn, since we've just been hearing from Pilar about the work of the ICRC, I think this next question for Hiba actually works quite well. An anonymous attendee has asked, how does Geneva Call, or does Geneva Call work together with the ICRC in that mission of strengthening IHL? I think they've noted that IHL is also playing an important role, as you said, Hiba, in the work of Geneva Call. So wondering about the relationship there and how you're working together. Over to you.
Well, thank you for the question. I think first and foremost, maybe it's also interesting to look at from where Geneva Call actually evolved. So the starting point was actually to strengthen armed non-state actors' respect of the rules when it comes to the use of landmines. So this was really the key starting point where there was a need to look at, okay, states are agreeing on frameworks to reduce or prohibit the use of landmines, but how is this affecting armed non-state actors, and how is this discussion taken forward at that level? So what Geneva Call does and has created over time is to have specific tools targeted towards armed non-state actors, where they can voice their adherence to these norms. Because as we know, that the international structure and the whole treaty structure is not made for armed non-state actors. And what we have provided is already over 20 years that this work has started, and also we are currently working on different thematics as well, such as the protection of children, the prohibition of sexual violence and gender discrimination, access to healthcare, etc. So it's an evolving landscape of what specific thematics we are talking about. But what we are trying, which is maybe a little bit different from what the ICRC does, and the way they approach the engagement with armed non-state actors, and maybe Pilar can say a little bit more on that, is to a certain extent the same content or the same discussion, probably just framed differently. What we do is more on getting their commitment, or as publicly as we can, also to strengthen their ownership, to strengthen their commitment long term to the changes that will follow a commitment to these norms and the respect of these norms. And then we take it forward with the group from there. So of course with the ICRC, we are always coordinating, if it's at HQ level, but also in the field in the different contexts where we are intervening. And we also make sure that the protection is also complementary, right? So that our engagement is also complementary, and that we have similar messaging, at least, so that it is clear that the obligations are the same, and what is actually requested of the armed non-state actors is also the respect of these same norms. So that would be my response.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Hiba. Now we've heard, of course, from Hiba about engagement with non-state armed actors. We've heard from our other colleagues, in particular Pilar and Lisa, about engagement with state actors as well. We have a question here from Rick that I'd like to pose first quickly to Pilar and then as well to Lisa. Rick is asking, how do civilian safety approaches need to change when we're dealing with international private military contractors or even mercenary groups? So just a quick question, but over to you, Pilar, and then we'll go to Lisa.
How our approach to protection of civilians may change. I mean, it is definitely a complex issue, very much in vogue these days. First of all, I have to say that those private military security companies are not acting on their own. They're commissioned or engaged through a responsible party. And as such, if they're supporting one of the parties to a conflict, there's a duty bearer that holds the responsibility in relation to the actions of the private military security company that is engaged in the conflict. As such, the engagement and protection of civilians should be similar or the same as to the one that we have in terms of engaging on a dialogue with the responsible party for that engagement with the private security company. Now, it is true that being in the field and for our field colleagues and having to deal with these companies, this is another matter. There's the Montreux document that many of you may know in relation to the application of IHL to private military security companies, and there's the wealth of information that you can find in the ICRC website in relation to that. I'm not going to go beyond that. There's a duty bearer in relation to, as I said, who commissions and pays that military security company. And as an ICRC, we engage with those duty bearers in relation to the behavior and potential violations. So our approach doesn't necessarily change.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that, Pilar. And Lisa, do you have anything to add on this question?
I think Pilar covered pretty much the approach that we are using in Civic as well. I think the key points here are to work with the kind of the owners of these private military and security companies, obviously, because in many cases they're directly or indirectly are attached to the governments, and the governments have their also, like their treaties and international agreements that they have to adhere to. But at the same time, obviously, some of them are really like private and business oriented. So therefore, it requires a different approach, mostly around these, like building and their understanding of the strategic value of protection of civilians as part of their operations, right? So it's a little bit different approach. It's basically translating the international norms into very concrete things that are more comprehensive and more understandable for military and security parties. And Civic is a part of a group of NGOs who is promoting a set of rules for this kind of for PMSCs. So we are working hard to have most of them to sign this treaty so that there is a framework that helps them to implement protection of civilians in their activities. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. And then finally, Tiffany, we have a question for you from Matt, who writes as follows. It is great to see Nonviolent Peace Force in this panel, given their approach of accompaniment, presence, and non-interference in community group decisions. My question is, how can humanitarians, sorry, I've lost the question. It just disappeared. Okay. Sorry, my colleague moved it. My question is how humanitarians can learn from community-led protection approaches, particularly such as the civil disobedience movement in Myanmar and other countries that are not necessarily couched in humanitarian and protection principles. Over to you, Tiffany.
Thanks, and I think it's a great question. I would approach it from sort of two sides. I guess the very pragmatic, action-oriented side, if we look at sort of, again, hyper-localized, hyper-grassroots engagement, where people may have vague familiarity or no familiarity at all on IHL and other norms that are out there. If we look at what actually happens, so we look at skills development around things like de-escalation, that really are rooted in interdependence and mutuality, self-protection in that sense, where the regardless of the approach to whatever the issue that is being argued over, conflicted over, is finding the common ground and the role that everybody can play in sort of the nonviolent approach and reduced violence approach to addressing that problem. As we all know, conflict is inevitable. Violence doesn't have to be. So really from that action oriented, it's a very person to person sometimes it feels, excruciatingly slow because we all want to see a wide systems change, but a system is only made up of people. And if we can really look at what happens in these local initiatives, it's a couple of people getting together and recognizing and working together in interdependence. And to go with those activities, I think really what it calls for all of us to explore is really the principles of nonviolence. So we have, legal principles, and then we have the principles of nonviolence, which are rooted deeply in recognizing and honoring the dignity and protection of ourselves, one another, people, and planet. And we live in a space where we've really normalized violence. We talk about legalized violence, legal acts of war, the death penalty. And when we see these sort of acts of resistance at the local level, saying that they will not accept in their day-to-day engagement, regardless of the violent action that's happening around them, to be part and parcel of that kind of engagement, we collectively, as a humanitarian community, have a great deal to learn from that.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for that, Tiffany. Now, with a bit of an idea of the programs that we're discussing, I'd like to move on to our next section, which is to ask all of you if there is a particular concrete success story that you would be able to share that shows how, practically speaking, this kind of programming that you've been sharing with us can work in practice. So let's start this time with Hiba. I understand you had wanted to highlight an example from the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. Could you tell us a bit about this and what made the programming successful? Over to you.
Thank you. So actually, this is part of the work we have done really to start bringing these humanitarian norms closer and to the community, but at the same time, institutionalizing it pretty much as part of the way armed non-state actors work. So, for example, in the Palestinian camps in Lebanon, in 2012, we started training members of the community, but also members who were close to the Palestine Liberation Organization and the security forces, which are affiliated with the PLO. With the Palestine Liberation Organization in the Palestinian camps. So you might know the Palestinian camps in Lebanon are really, to a certain extent, run by the Palestinian factions, which are pretty much in charge of enforcing law and order in the setting of the Palestinian camps. So what we have done is starting 2012 to start working with the local community to create the so-called legal support unit. So this legal support unit, we had trained them as trainers, and they were taking on the task and are still doing so until today. As you might see, they are in the pictures providing some guidance or training to the Palestinian National Security Forces on the prevention of COVID-19 and the measures that they would need to respect internally or see respected within the community. So they are training the members of the Palestinian National Security Forces and the Joint Security Forces in the camp on humanitarian norms. They have draft a code of conduct, which was adopted in 2019 by the security forces, and are very much the focal point now for international actors, UN agencies, and others when it comes to discussing protection issues in the camps, but also having a kind of internal dynamic as to how are the Palestinian National Security Forces conducting themselves. Is it in accordance with international standards? Is it in accordance with their own commitments that they have made towards the increased protection of civilians in the camp? So this is very much a localized entity, which is constantly there, constantly looking at what's going on, involved in the day-to-day developments of the situation inside the Palestinian camps, and who can really address the different issues that arise. If it's internal clashes in the Palestinian camps and how they are responding to that, if it's really responding to crimes in general, responding maybe to indiscriminate shootings in the camps when there are weddings, etc. So this kind of violence that is not directly linked to armed conflict, but can take different different forms. So, and as you might see, the unit is headed by a woman, and in a very male-dominated context. She has been able to also bring the issues through this kind of soft diplomacy as well, to be able to make a change. So this has been a really long-term involvement with the legal support unit, and at the same time, as also Tiffany already mentioned, this is a really long process. So until we see the change of this kind of training session, where they are really talking to the different commanders, but also talking to the members of the security forces, and until we can see this behavioral change, and this takes a while. But obviously, having people on the ground, they can tell you then again how repeatedly members of the Palestinian National Security Forces come to them and tell them that these trainings that were provided to them have really changed the way they look at themselves and at their role, so that they don't see themselves as fighters in these camps. They rather see themselves now as law enforcement officials to a certain extent, who really have the protection of the civilians at the core of their mission. So this would be the success story that I would like to share from our contexts.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Hiba. Now, turning to Pilar, your example is about successfully influencing an armed group. And I know we have had a number of questions coming in the last few minutes about this. So very much looking forward to hear from you about this example. Please do go ahead. Over to you.
So the successful example deals with an armed group with whom we've been having a relationship for a number of years. So it's a long-term relationship and a long-term investment. But as part of our regular meetings, right before the cyclic wave of violence, we decided to touch base in order to discuss the upcoming operations. We knew that the group was going to launch a military operation, and we wanted to stress some of the key messages that we usually repeat. So we sat down, we stressed very strongly the need to avoid civilian casualties during the attack, and more than that, we actually put them in a situation in which they needed to let us know what were the kind of instructions that the group was giving to the fighters, and whether or not they were included in those messages the protection of civilians. So we had this conversation. We discussed around around civilian harm, about the military operations, and a few days later, we saw the NSAG in its official website publishing a statement instructing fighters to avoid the killing of innocent humans, and the statement went as far as asking the fighters to try to prevent any human losses. So that was an interesting development, since it was the first time that the group pronounced itself in relation to the protection of civilians, and went quite broad in the instructions. And what was interesting for us as well is the use of the language and the support with quotes from customary norms that accompany that message, and that helped us to understand how to use then the same messages in our protection dialogue in the field with the fighters at the ground level. So that's all for me.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And moving now to Tiffany, the story that you had selected comes, as I understand, from your program in South Sudan. Could you tell us just briefly about that and how that's been a success? Over to you, Tiffany.
An element of our programming in South Sudan is really focused on inclusivity, which is one of sort of the key factors in breaking down the power paradigm that allows violence to continue apace. And in the peace and security realm, of course, that really includes working very intentionally with women, and supporting and encouraging and helping to facilitate space for women to take leadership roles in peace and security in their community, rather than, as has been more traditionally the approach, being treated as parties that are more vulnerable and require third-party protection only, in not as well as a space to be active and equal participants. And how that has evolved over time in the South Sudan program is a project or a program we call Women's Protection Teams. As you can see from the photo, the Women's Protection Teams are peopled by women of the local community. And this was born out of a real recognized need of seeing, firstly, an absence of women participating in the peace and security space at the local level. And what we were hearing from local women, which was very sharp, very nuanced, and very developed analysis in terms of what the threats were and their own vulnerabilities, both as individuals and as communities, to security issues, as well as what they were already doing to protect themselves and each other at the community level. And they expressed the interest to learn more, develop those skills more, and to be supported, to be recognized, and move into that space. So over time, that's really developed across the country, and the women really drive the agenda of what's important to them in their community. They work on a whole range of issues, everything from violence in schools, intimate partner domestic violence, all the way to direct negotiations with armed actors, both state and armed state and non-state armed actors. One particular story that always stands out for me relates to one of the women's protection teams being in an area where a military unit had moved in and become quite dominant in the space. Lots of soldiers, they were there for national security deployment. And what had happened is there had been a real increase in attacks on women, sexual violence, and the direct outcome of that was girls were no longer being permitted to go to school in order to keep them safe. So the women were really concerned about both the immediate violence concern and what this meant for the long-term health and well-being of the girls in their community being able to access their education. So we worked with them, asked them what they wanted to do. In the end, it became really important that they wanted to be we had very good relationships with the local military commanders, and we could have just gone and spoken on their behalf and raised our concerns as an international organization, and that could have had some impact. Rather than doing simply that, what we did is just utilize our good offices and our relationships with the commanders and to support the women and to facilitate and make that introduction so that they could go and feel safe and supported and confident enough to do that direct negotiation themselves. So it started off with a very slow, careful raising of concerns to a fully open door relationship where the women had and the commanding officers had each other's numbers where it was possible. They were able to go and be received and to address complaints. And really what was most notable is there was a direct drop off in incidents related to sexual violence and attacks on the women and an increase in the girls returning to school.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Tiffany. And now finally over to Lisa. What success story have you selected? Over to you, Lisa.
Thank you. So I believe I will continue the trend set up by Hiva and Tiffany to talk about our community-based protection initiatives. It looks like there is more success always at that grassroots level. So unlike my colleagues, we just started testing this approach in Ukraine and mainly the civil-military dialogues. So, like a year ago when we were doing the scoping exercise, talking to different partners, others who were doing simple dialogue type of work, when we told them that we are planning to do civil military dialogues, they were like, "Are you sure? Good luck." So there's so many skepticism around this particular initiative. And more so, this skepticism actually was supported by the data from our baseline survey, which we conducted in 12 communities along the contact line. Nearly half of the respondents, and we had 1,200 people who answered our questions, felt that they don't have any trust to the military. They don't feel comfortable to approach them with any security or protection issues, and more so, they were not even willing to do so because they just, felt that it's just unnecessary. So regardless, these not very encouraging numbers, we decided to move on with this initiative. Obviously, it was a very cautious approach. We conducted a very robust selection process for the community members to train in negotiation and dialogue facilitation skills. We did the same with civil military cooperation officers at the military, CIMIC officers. We adapted the Harvard negotiation project to the Ukrainian context and to similar contexts, with similar challenges. Developed locally tailored scenarios, role games. So a huge work was done in this prep phase. And then we trained the two groups, the civilians and the military CIMIC officers. And obviously, after this, again, it was several modules of trainings. We supported the actual civil-military dialogues. Today, so we started probably, the trainings took place late last year. And now we are seeing that in 11 communities which were selected for this pilot initiative, everywhere there is an ongoing discussion or communication going on between civilians and military. They moved from less sensitive issues, obviously, as Tiffany mentioned, that there is a need for this trust building and relationship building before you start raising really very concerning issues. And now what we are seeing that really sensitive issues are brought up in these discussions, like, for example, allegation of looting of houses by military, or these, communal services debts that military leave behind after occupying public or private houses, and then they move out, and then, the civilians have to deal with these issues. A couple of weeks ago, we had a very emotional discussion on a checkpoint, which was put in the middle of a village. And obviously, civilians were very angry, and they felt being humiliated when they're checked like several times a day when they're crossing, to go to school or to the store. For us, the success was that even with this emotional discussion, they came to the conclusion that they want to continue jointly work on this issue and to find ways how to improve the situation. Obviously, it's very difficult to resolve all issues in one dialogue, right? So it's a series of conversations, of dialogues, and then actions actually to support the commitments that the parties take. But again, knowing that that even such sensitive issues, they don't lead to even bigger conflict, but rather to looking for and common ground. That's really encouraging, and I hope in a year from now we will be able to share really great examples of successes from these dialogues. And just to highlight that. We believe that if these dialogues, civil-military dialogues, are done in the right way, they do bring to long-lasting results and improve the resiliency of the communities. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Lisa. Now, the overall idea of looking at these different approaches is, of course, to help others to learn from the experiences of your four organizations. And I can see in the chat there's already a lot of appreciation for the examples that you've shared. So thank you very much on behalf of of everyone on the call for the work that you've done to distill, to highlight and distill these experiences. If we can take it a step further, I'd like to go once more around the panel now to ask our speakers to really distill what you think from those examples, what you think others can learn from them. So let's turn first to Lisa. What would you say are the main lessons, from Civic's work that you would highlight for other organizations? Over to you, Lisa.
Thank you. So I think I will refer to what I already talked to, and just to distill what are the key lessons learned for us, and hopefully they're will be helpful for others. So as I talked in the first session, that prevention of civilian harm is as important as addressing harm when it's caused. So therefore, it requires a different type of approach, normally a very systematic and at various levels. Another thing is which we found, especially working in Ukraine, that there are different types of warfare, right, in the world right now. And Ukraine is basically a testing ground for hybrid warfare. So this understanding of these specifics of the context requires also thinking through new approaches. For example, in Civic, we are thinking through how the this hybrid nature of the warfare and the huge information campaign, which is a part of this type of warfare, whether the POC, protection of civilians, and civilian harm mitigation approaches need to be adapted to the systems of the security and defense sectors, or even civilian agencies. And as I mentioned in the description of our civil-military dialogues, piloting new initiatives is important. And yes, sometimes the basics, or where you are starting, the baseline is not very conducive, or there are many, risks associated. But if done thoroughly and well prepared, they were taking this chance, and they were trying these approaches. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. And turning to Tiffany, what lessons would you highlight for our other organizations to learn from the experiences of yours? Over to you, Tiffany.
Great, thank you. I really think that in terms of, you see my point, the bullet point there says we need to radically center persons impacted by violence. And NPs are, as if anybody knows our work, I mean, we are already really grassroots, really oriented in the community, and we still have more work to do about centering our work and centering all our engagement around persons most impacted by violence. And we work within a humanitarian systems, and systems are not notoriously sensitive to people. And I think we have a great deal of work to do there. As I said previously, violence being the ultimate manifestation of the abuse of power. So when we're unpacking power dynamics and power relationships, really recognizing that in order to really get to widespread, really effective prevention work, we need to address those power and privilege structures. We have existed, and our system has grown up, and the work that we do has really come up around being separate. We are separate, we're neutral, we're independent, and all of those principles are in place for good reasons. There's a sort of philosophical leap that can underpin our work and the way that we approach things, that really moves us into more of an interdependence approach. Again, going back to this concept around mutuality and mutual protection. We, from the top down, from those decisions at policy level that turn into funding decisions, that turn into our projects, we continue to see that the use of force or the threat of force, whether that be an armed peacekeeping force, a regional force, a train and equip mission, continues to be the privileged economic investment for conflict management, conflict prevention, and ultimately the civilian protection work that we all collectively do. And we need to work on shifting that paradigm to balancing that investment out, so that we're seeing an increasing privileging of civilian-led, nonviolent, unarmed approaches to these things. And just collectively, I think we need to be very carefully that we have an outsized and often ill-defined focus on vulnerabilities, and working with people who are affected by violence and violent conflict. And we have a bit of a blind spot around the levels of capacities that already exist, the things that are already happening, and the willingness, and we've heard a lot about this in the other examples, of being willing to engage directly with the threats and sort of recognizing our own role there. So I think there's a lot of learning we can do and continue to develop on.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much, Tiffany. We have a couple of questions I'd like to pose to you, but I'm going to wait until we get to the Q&A at the end, because I want to make sure we get through all of the planned rounds here. I'd like to turn to Pilar. What would you suggest that other organizations can learn from the ICRC's work to prevent violence in armed conflict? Over to you, Pilar.
So one of the important things that we think is key for the design of prevention interventions is the analysis of the root causes. So important to have that analysis before the design of the interventions, as well as having an analysis of the influencers. Because many times, and I saw a question in the chat around how to work with local influencers, we may not go directly through the parties, but actually see who else can help us implement the prevention activities or pass on the prevention messages. It is also very important to identify distinctive mechanisms that may trigger violations against civilians, because this may facilitate the effective prevention or mitigating measures that we may put in place. The actions to address violations against civilians may occur for different reasons. It may be part of a group's policy, and therefore we may design the intervention with one aim in mind in a different way, or violations may occur as a social practice or group dynamic, and this may require a different intervention. So important to understand that. So the ICRC attempts to persuade commanders to adopt and enforce rules and norms after assessing whether the negative behavior occurs more as a policy or a practice, and then we adapt the response. So it's one of the key lessons learned that we have. And then for prevention activities to be effective, the targeted group has to be able to obviously enforce the behavioral change. I saw a couple of questions as well on groups that might not be able either to enforce the behavioral change or may not be willing to actually change that behavior. And finally, maybe that prevention efforts have to be sustained over the medium and long term. There are no shortcuts for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Pilar. And finally, Hiba, what would be your recommendations for other organizations? Over to you.
Well, I think many of the points were also highlighted by our fellow panelists. I think one of the key issues where we as Geneva Call, especially as a small organization, and in order to build the required trust to be able to work on the sensitive issues we try to work on, be it at the level of the armed non-state actors, but also supporting the community in a safe way to develop their own mechanisms, we need to adopt an inclusive and transparent approach. Just to also make sure that what we are suggesting or the way we are providing our support to the community or addressing violations perpetrated by the armed non-state actors is actually done in consultation to understand what is the real issue at hand and how can you also generate more ownership from the side of these actors to actually change their conduct going forward. So the approach is also very, very important to look at the grassroots level and understand the different contexts, because each context has their own specificities, as we know, and what works in a certain context might not necessarily work in another. So really listening in to what is the community highlighting, what are the violations they are suffering from, what do they suggest, what are their priorities, and then accordingly adapt the intervention. Also, what has been really important for us, looking ahead and more long term, is as much as we can to always include local capacity building efforts in whatever we do. We might be there for, in the context intervening for a couple of years, then we might withdraw. But the issue might still be relevant, and people on the ground will still have to deal with it on a day-to-day basis. So ensuring local communities are capacitated and local armed non-state actors also really understand their obligations, and the more support we can generate for that at the leadership level of the armed group, the longer term effect we can see. Of course, this is a very long endeavor we are talking about. So in parallel to our direct intervention, also looking at what kind of long-term structures can be put in place in the country. Also, one of the key issues, which is, at least for me, is also very relevant, is the role women can have in such contexts, and how we as humanitarian actors can create more space for women through propositions, through discussions with, be it in the local community or also with the armed non-state actors. I think a lot of the humanitarian files can also be willingly assigned to women, and female-led programs can be put in place. So this has been also very efficient, although maybe as Geneva called, the key focus would be on preventing violations, but also having women in that context could also lead to the prevention of violence in more general terms. And then we can see the link where we can again link the reduction in violations to the more long-term, keeping in view the long-term effect of being able to go back to peaceful negotiations, etc. So the more violations that we have, the less likely parties are to sit together at the table and discuss what has happened and find solutions, right? So this threshold of violations is really also key. If we can address that, although indirectly, we might have also a better impact on reducing, or minimizing the long-term effect. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Hiba. And now moving right along to our final section, so we will hopefully have some time for questions afterwards, but in this final section, we're going to briefly look at the systemic level. We've had a number of questions coming in about this, so saved all of these for the end. We'd like to look at how these programs that we've been hearing about fit into the overall humanitarian architecture or the humanitarian ecosystem. Is the current humanitarian and protection architecture conducive to this programming, and are there any changes needed to make this more effective? This is, of course, a big topic, but we wanted to get at least some initial thoughts from our presenters today. And I understand that Pilar will have to leave us soon, so let's turn first to you, Pilar, to hear your thoughts on this last question regarding the overall system. Over to you.
Thank you. So the global protection architecture at the basis is it's grounded on rights and obligations that are set out in IHL, but also in other bodies of law, and the prevention work, it's really based around facilitated and creating the environment for these legal obligations to be incorporated into domestic legislation, and then into, as I said before, normative and practical frameworks that may lead or may regulate the behavior of armed actors. So I think that it fits very well with the current protection architecture. Now, as we know, there's state institutions that are responsible for implementing these international obligations, and parties are responsible for the application of IHL. The application and monitoring of domestic laws and policies is also an obligation for the states. And obviously, there's a lot of challenges, particularly in relation to those authorities that might not be willing or may not have the capacity to actually implement those frameworks. And as such, some protection mechanisms and this environment building that may create the preventive action may be ineffective or inadequate. So thank you so much, and bye.
If you wouldn't mind, Pilar, before you disappear, we have had a couple of questions come in regarding humanitarian principles. And so before you leave, I would like, if you don't mind, to pose this to you. We've had some participants asking, essentially, how is it possible to adhere to humanitarian principles while engaging with armed actors? So having the sense that there may be a tension there. Another participant asking, is it possible to adhere to humanitarian principles while engaging with armed actors? I wonder if you could respond on that, please, Pilar, before you go.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I don't see any contradiction between being a neutral, impartial humanitarian actor and engaging in a dialogue with non-state-owned groups. In fact, IHL asks humanitarian organizations to tend to those in need, and the framework it is for the protection actually at the basis of armed actors. Then it was extended with the Fourth Geneva Convention to the protection of civilians, but it includes the protection of the wounded and sick and those that have stopped fighting. So it is for humanitarian organizations a duty to assist as well and protect non-state-owned groups. And in order to actually assist civilians, I don't see any other way than engaging with those that actually are at the roots of the suffering. So on the contrary, I don't see any contradiction between being an impartial and neutral and principled humanitarian actor and being able to have a dialogue on the protection of civilians and prevention with them. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Pilar, and thanks so much for taking the time to join the webinar.
Thank you to you all. It was a pleasure. Bye.
Bye. So now let's turn to Tiffany. Tiffany, how do you see nonviolent peace forces programming fitting into the current humanitarian system? Over to you.
Great. Well, I think it fits in a lot better than it used to. We certainly sat in rooms, cluster meetings, subcluster meetings, meetings with UN agencies and other donor partners, and had a lot of trouble finding common ground when we were talking about a focus on prevention and what were the articulated priorities of the various groups at the time. And that's really evolved. So on the plus side, I do see we're starting to see language around prevention and instructive language around civilian protection and civilian-led approaches appear in mission mandates, in humanitarian response plans, and priorities for the different elements within the system. It's still slow. As we know, systems, large things, changing direction take a long time to change directions. The end of Titanic would have been a different story if it could change quickly, and a lot of people died in that process. And I think that's the thing for us to remember, is that radical exploration of how to change the way we do our work to be more preventative as displacement escalates, climate chaos escalates, as we're working within a system that we all know is rooted and was built on a colonial, patriarchal, racist model to begin with. So we have a lot of exploration and opportunity for dramatic growth and change coming up in the coming years. I think doing this, really exchanging knowledge and credible evidence, it did not used to be, we used to get, almost laughed out of rooms when we talked about being nonviolent and unarmed on front lines. And that's changed a lot because there is body of evidence, there's research, there's impact studies that show not anything is a miracle cure, not everything works in every situation, but that our toolkit is much bigger and broader than we realize. And without sliding into the danger of over-systematizing something that works particularly well if it's decentralized, hyper-flexible, and hyper-adaptable, there is some power in the group and really looking at collectively, continually shifting our shared practices and exemplary models towards a prevention model that will hopefully turn into increased funding and support, and ultimately less violence and safer people everywhere.
Thanks so much, Tiffany. I'd like to come with a follow-up question. It came in a bit earlier, but I think since you've been speaking now, the term obviously comes up again, prevention, and we've had some participants asking for clarity regarding the definition there. So I wonder if you could indulge us and maybe just take a bit of time to help the group to understand really what we mean by prevention, and maybe an additional question there would be whether there is a problem as well in the humanitarian community in having an agreed understanding of what prevention is. Over to you.
Sure. Common understanding and co-creating that common understanding is critical for us moving anywhere. From an NP perspective and from the work that we do, when we're talking about prevention, we're trying to work on stopping the violence before it happens. And my caveat to this, because I can feel the energy jump in the group and say, but these are complex conflict environments, and who are we to think that we can stop a war or we can stop widespread violence? And that's absolutely true. There, as I said, there's no magic solution. It's not like if we just use this toolkit, everything will stop overnight. So the work we look at is in two tracks. The direct prevention, the direct protection work that we're working on is, for example, if we have a group of activists or a group living in a community that is being directly targeted for whatever reason, their identity, their work. And if we're able to have a protective accompaniment team spend time in their presence, literally physically accompanying those individuals or that community, what we see is, in most cases, not all, but in most cases, and there's a lot of back work that goes into this, deciding if this is something that will work or not, the violence does not happen. So if somebody's getting a death threat or threat of destruction to their home, if there's a protection team that's leveraging relationships, and that's a longer conversation how it all works, but it's literally interrupting before the violence happens. So we're all much better to be doing that rather than treating the injured afterwards. That being said, of course, it's more complicated. Of course, that will still happen. And so a lot of the work that we do then is, for example, helping communities getting really prepared from a very localized, community-based early warning, early response perspective, saying if violence is inevitable, if that advancing force is coming towards your community, and there is no stopping that, those are powers outside of all of our collective control. As a community, what is the safest way you can get through this? Can you organize your evacuation teams? Who is going to help whom? Who's going to make sure the children and those with reduced mobilities who can't move as well? Can you pre-position supplies somewhere? So if you're running from your home, you can get to where there is food or water while you're hiding out. So it's taking it, but it's literally trying to stop violence from happening at all, or the injury happening in the moment.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Tiffany. Really appreciate it. Turning to Hiba, how do you see Geneva Call's work in the overall humanitarian ecosystem? Over to you, Hiba.
Thank you. So maybe I would like to say that it has been traditionally the role of Geneva Call, or the work we do, has been challenging and hasn't been the traditional way humanitarians also view their own work, right? So the humanitarian work is often understood as service delivery rather than engaging with armed non-state actors to ensure they respect the international humanitarian law, right? So this is kind of a different perspective to it, which I think is essential, and it's really complementary. I think we would love to work on preventing violence from happening in the first place, and then we'd be sitting with no work to do, right? Which would be great in that sense. But given the actual presence of armed non-state actors and the ongoing conflicts, what can be done there, right? So this engagement still remains crucial. And I think a lot of the time there is a little bit of a shift, of course, with the recognition of the need to engage armed non-state actors, and given their increasing role in the armed conflicts across the world. So this is shifting a little bit. But for us, one of the main challenges, if you would like, is accessing the traditional humanitarian funding for our activities, especially given that we do not have an accompanying assistance program which would run in parallel with our activities. So our activities are purely really there to improve the conduct of armed non-state actors and improve the protection of civilians in armed conflict. So, of course, this said, we do consider that our work would span the humanitarian development peace nexus, because we believe, and obviously it is the case, that the increased respect for humanitarian norms would support stabilization efforts. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, so if we are able to reduce violations, then we can support these stabilization efforts and find ways to really find space for dialogue or create more space for peace building activities or these kinds of efforts, be it at the community level or also with other organizations and specialized agencies working on the topic. So this is also a way how we might fit in as well. Generally, and in many of the contexts, Geneva Call has also been a messenger between humanitarian actors and armed non-state actors, especially in areas where there are issues when it comes to access to humanitarian access and challenges faced by humanitarian organizations. So in contexts where we have established good relationships with the armed non-state actors, we are able to really open the space for dialogue, take specific protection messages or anything that humanitarian actors might want to flag, especially those who have restrictions when it comes to directly engaging with these armed non-state actors. And there we can play a role of really being the messenger between these two organizations, or these two sides. One last thing, which is also really challenging and these days, are the counter-terrorism legislations. And obviously this is not only affecting Geneva Call, but many of the humanitarian actors engaged in areas where there are terrorist organizations or listed armed non-state actors. So for us, also the need to depoliticize engagement with armed non-state actors is really important. Because these people, there are these populations living under the control or under the influence of armed non-state actors are also worthy of protection. And for that, we must also see this as a means to really improve the situation of civilians in these areas. So these would be maybe a general look at how the humanitarian infrastructure is currently, or how this is, how our work fits into this infrastructure.
Great, thanks a lot. Thank you very much, Hiba. We have a question from Karim that I would like to pose to you. Karim is asking, how can international organizations, and by this I think he means generally speaking international NGOs and other such organizations as we're talking about today, how can they protect civilians when neither the United Nations nor even the Security Council can protect them? He's thinking specifically about the situation in Syria, but pointing to this being a problem all over the world. What would you say to that, Hiba, about what an organization like Geneva Call or like any other NGO could bring that is different from the kind of protection that the UN is able to provide to civilians? Over to you.
So maybe looking at our approach or the things we do as Geneva Call is very much at a direct engagement level. So I do think there are different levels if we're talking at the political level, what the UN or the international community can do, or what big UN agencies can do. I think so there are different layers to that, and where we would fit as Geneva Call, or something that can be done more directly, is talking to the armed non-state actors themselves, the ones who are actually on the ground, and trying to get them on board to improve the protection of civilians, to get their understanding of their obligations, to get them to see what is the long-term impact of their lack of respect of the norms, and how this affects the population, how this affects them, their families, their communities, etc. So it's very much at the direct level that this is being taken forward, and also with the communities and what is their role there. How can they be agents of their own protection, as Lisa put it? So this is really one of the levels, and I think it's really crucial. This is not something that can create the desired impact on its own. I think we had also questions about, I saw in the chat about what concrete impact we have. I think it's also difficult to just say this is Geneva Cool's impact or this is such organization's impact, because we all work together or in a complementary manner in these different contexts, and each one has their own entry point and their own specialty and their own target group, etc. So I think it's really, we need to look at the different layers, and each organization will have to see what can we address, what maybe others are not addressing, and in that way provide a bit more support to the civilian communities.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that, Hiba. Now, turning to Lisa, what changes do you see as needed for the humanitarian architecture to better support prevention work? Over to you.
Thank you. So I think when it gets to protection of civilians, in many cases, the first thing that pops in the mind of especially the humanitarian community is that it's very kind of humanitarian type of work, quick emergency type, like very reactive when a conflict already happened. So everybody goes and, and tries to support the conflict-affected people. But when we get to prevention, it's more of a development type of work because it requires a lot of efforts and a lot of time in many cases to create that protective environment. It could be working at the legislative level, working with armed actors to build their capabilities so that they can protect civilians, and working also at the community level as well. And a lot of time, the community level work, in our case, when I was referring to our civil-military dialogues, they also viewed as part of peace building or stabilization type of work, especially when we are talking about longer term perspectives. There is always time after conflicts when there are different processes like reintegration is going on, which also poses protective issues in many cases. So, like preparing the communities to deal with these issues is also a part of prevention. So therefore, I think, like when we are talking about protection, so that's the thing that we have to understand, that it's a very comprehensive work. It requires comprehensive approach, which means I don't want to say new types of coordination mechanisms, because there are so many of them already and nobody wants to create new ones. But in many cases, probably it's a part of organizations like Geneva Call, like ICRC and Civic, to establish even further more in-depth coordination between these organizations who are working on this very targeted and specific issue. And that's what we are doing in Ukraine, basically. When, when we came into the country, okay, we were part of the OCHA system, but not quite fit, like in what they were discussing. The development environment doesn't have their one big coordination system. We talked to some peace building organizations, but again, like they don't see us as their peers, because we are not working on humanitarian work. So therefore, we ended up creating a small advisory group on protection of civilians, which brought together exactly these very focused organizations. So that's something to look out to, and to ensure very good coordination. Each organization has their niche, which has to be recognized and not duplicated, and very coordinated. And obviously, the same approach applies to many donor funding mechanisms. There are not many donors who understand this very comprehensive approach to protection of civilians, especially prevention of harm to civilians. And I think this is huge, and there is a lot of work to educate them and to kind of deliver this message that it's not a 1 year small project to deliver, or to save lives. I mean, yes, we are saving lives, but to ensure that even more lives are saved, and there should be more investment into big systematic systems put in place to prevent any harm to civilians in potential conflicts. So I think that's it from my side at this point.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Lisa. I know we're right at the end of our time, but I do have one quick follow-up question for you, if you don't mind. This is from Fred, who, well, we've actually had a lot of people asking about issues related to direct attacks on civilians. There are a lot of concerns about that, of course. Fred asking specifically, in the face of deliberate attacks against civilians, should the humanitarian system do more to support practical measures such as early warning systems, evacuation plans, measures to reinforce health facilities, search and rescue teams, etc.? What are your thoughts on this, Lisa?
Oh, absolutely, and that's the whole point of all our work. That's our role, to basically build those infrastructures that could be shelters, evacuation plans put in place ahead of any potential conflict, building up the skills of the armed actors involved, so that in their operation or counterattack, they are thinking also about the consequences to the civilian population, right? Because there are so many nuances there, how they conduct their military operation to protect civilians or to protect the territory, basically. So yeah, absolutely, and there is that's why there should be a very joint and coordinated efforts, given that different organizations have different approaches, different technical expertise, which are absolutely complementary in this whole big approach and protecting civilians.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Lisa. Now, I'd really love to thank all of our panelists. It's been a really rich discussion. We've covered a lot of ground, and I think it was particularly helpful to hear the practical examples from your work. I could see in the chat it really engaged everyone in the subject matter, and we of course received far more questions than we're able to address now. So I do hope that we'll all be able to continue the discussion afterwards. But now, as we wrap up, I'd like to go once more around the panel for a very brief 30-second closing remarks. Feel free to draw on if you saw items in the chat or questions that we weren't able to get to. If you want to refer to those, feel free to do that. Let's go first to Hiba, Lisa, and then Tiffany for just brief 30-second final thoughts. Over to you, Hiba.
Thank you. Well, I must say I also learned a lot from our other fellow panelists. So I'm very happy also to see how the different activities we are implementing or our different interventions intersect, overlap, complement each other. And it's really a great opportunity. Also, thank you for organizing this and giving us the space to exchange. So for me, really the key takeaway here would be how can we look at what are we good at as an organization, where do we have the knowledge and where do we have the expertise, and how can we make this available to other organizations really in a really complementary way? How can we make it available or accessible to the communities, taking into consideration their own traditions, what has been done there previously. So I think there is also a lot of dialogue that has to go with the planning of any intervention, actually, if it comes at So to really to look at what is existing there, what can work for the people on the ground, what do they want, and can we or can we not respond to all of these questions? Is there something for us to do? And then look at other actors and take it in a complementary manner. So I think, so again, thank you for giving us this opportunity, and I'm sure there will be some follow-up discussions on several topics. Thank you.
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Hiba. Really appreciate your taking the time for this today. And now back to you, Lisa, for your brief closing remarks. So
I think I'm joining the gratitude and this opportunity to discuss the approaches that the different organizations are taking towards protection of civilians. And I'm really pleased that prevention was highlighted as an important and thing, especially in current context where we see different types of conflicts. There are a lot of frozen conflicts when you never know what happens in the next day. So I think there should be a lot more discussion on coordination and how we work together, and not only implementers, but also those organizations who are providing resources, funds for this type of work. And yes, thank you again to everybody, to the participants for their active participation. A lot of questions still coming in, and to my colleagues, fellow panelists, for such an enriching discussion, and to the organizers, obviously, for organizing this event. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks so much for your inputs today as well. Really great to have you as part of the discussion. So thanks again. And last but not least, Tiffany, you have the floor for brief closing remarks.
Echoing my fellow panelists, I've learned a lot and I've been inspired. And thank you so much for everybody who's here and the participation. I guess, my kind of final thoughts are, it's really easy to become paralyzed or frozen in what feels like the inevitability and the complexity of violent conflict, violence in general. And I just to remind ourselves that on the outside, on the macro level, it seems untouchable, but it's just made up of thousands, if not millions, of entry points. And if we can all work in some of those entry points to work on reducing and preventing some of that violence, we can make a fairly substantive difference in people's lives, and maybe someday our own. There was a time where we thought earthquakes happened, tsunamis happened, and inevitably we would suffer, our cities would fall down. And we've learned to build a standing capacity about reducing risk around natural disasters. We can also build a standing capacity around violence prevention. We have that capacity, we have that within us, if we just choose to make that commitment and work towards it. Thank you.
Excellent, Tiffany. Thanks so much. Really wonderful food for thought to leave us with. Appreciate that. And thanks for your time today. So that's it, folks. We've come to the end of this session. It's been really great having all of you on the line. There will be a recording of the event, both in video and in audio-only podcast format that will be available on the event page in the coming days. Please do also join us next week on Tuesday, the 30th of March, for the second part in this webinar series. We'll be looking at community-based protection, early warning, and conflict preparedness initiatives, and we will be joined by speakers from Norwegian People's Aid, the Local to Global Protection Initiative, the Danish Refugee Council in Nigeria, and SOPROP in Goma. You can register at the link you see on your screen. Pay attention, please, to the time of the event, as it may be different in your location due to daylight savings time, which starts in many countries on Sunday, and has already started in other countries, I may add. In the meantime, you can continue the discussion in the PHAP community online. I would recommend that you log in straight away now, assuming you're not going into another Zoom call. Please log in straight away now and share your main takeaways from this session, share your recommendations from your own experience. My colleagues will be sharing the link to this discussion thread in the chat now, so you can jump right over. Also, as mentioned, we'll be following up with our speakers to see if they might be able to help answer some of the questions we didn't get to today in the session, and then we'll post those responses as well in the community. So with that, would like to thank everyone, both panelists and participants, again for a very interesting discussion. This is Inherit Lang with PHAP signing off from Geneva. Thank you and bye-bye.